Welcome in, everyone, to the deep dive. We're going to dig into something pretty interesting today, I think. We're looking at the commercial real estate, the CRE, in Whitestown, Indiana.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't heard much about Whitestown.
Yeah, and you wouldn't think of it necessarily as a major player, but this article by Cara Conde called Whitestown CRE Grow Up, How It's Outshining the Neighbors, makes a pretty compelling argument that there's something really big happening over there.
Okay, all right.
Let's
I'm
go over.
interested to see what's going on over there.
Yeah, so what's fascinating, and as we kind of get into this article, is the sheer scale of the transformation we're talking about. It's like, how does a smaller, kind of more traditionally rural place become such a big deal, a fast-growing hub for things like logistics and industrial development? And I think what's going to be really key for our listeners who are following these market trends is to understand how Whitestown stacks up against some of the more established, the big names around it.
Hmm.
Places like Lebanon, Zionsville, and of course the 800-pound gorilla, Indianapolis.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to really get into the nuts and bolts of this glow up, as Cara Conde calls it.
Okay.
We want to figure out, what are the core reasons that are driving this impressive growth in CRE in Whitestown? And then, the next step, what does that mean for the bigger economic picture of central Indiana? And Conde's article, by the way, is fantastic for this. It gives us that historical context, where has Whitestown come from, then, where it's at right now.
Yeah.
Things like vacancy rates, what are the lease costs looking like, and that's key information. But importantly, and I think this is where it gets really interesting for us, she gives these direct comparisons with the surrounding areas.
Right, head to head.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
And just to kind of add another layer to this, I think it's important to keep in mind that Cara Conde is a CRE agent.
Oh, okay.
She's actually working in Whitestown.
So she knows her stuff.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So her insights aren't just like theoretical. They're coming from actual deals, the day-to-day realities of that local market.
Right, so it's boots on the ground information.
Exactly. Yeah. So she's really in the trenches. So that gives us, I think, a very valuable ground level perspective on all these changes. So, all right, let's jump into it. Let's talk about this growth story, right? I mean, the article starts by throwing out some pretty dramatic numbers.
Okay.
We're talking about a population that was under 500 people in 2000 and is projected to be over 10,000 by 2025.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's kind of crazy. That's a massive expansion in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, that's really something. It makes you think about what's fueling that growth, right? Like what's drawing all those people in.
Right. And it's not just people moving in. It's tied directly to this enormous increase in commercial space the past decade. Over 10 million square feet of new commercial real estate added in Whitestown.
That's huge.
It is. I mean, think about it. That's a lot of development for any municipality, let alone one that started with such a small footprint.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you start picturing all the buildings, the warehouses, the businesses that go with that kind of square footage. It's impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like, this is where the story gets really interesting. A real turning point was this thing called the Anson development, which was launched back in 2005.
Okay.
And this wasn't just like, a few random projects here and there. This was a huge, massive undertaking by Duke Realty.
Yeah.
And now it's Prologis.
Okay.
1,700 acres.
Whoa, that's ambitious.
Yeah. So this was a real visionary plan. And what's interesting about Anson, what was really smart about it, is the way it was designed. It wasn't just an industrial park. It was meant to be a complete, a whole self-contained ecosystem.
Interesting.
So you bring together industrial facilities, retail spaces, even residential areas. And that kind of that diversification.
Yeah, it's smart.
It really creates this really strong base for future expansion.
Yeah, it creates its own sort of self-sustaining cycle, right? I mean, you've got people living there, working there, shopping there.
Right. It all feeds on itself. And then the other thing that seemed to really accelerate things, kind of kick things into high gear, was landing some key early tenants.
Yeah, that makes sense. You get those big names in, and it creates a kind of snowball effect.
Yeah, exactly. So the article highlights GXO Logistics. They set up a 600,000 square foot distribution center back in 2015.
Okay.
And then Amazon,
Of course.
they come in 2020. A huge fulfillment center, 1 million square feet.
Wow.
And, those kinds of deals really put a place on the map,
Yeah.
for commercial development, for investors, for everyone.
Yeah, it sends a really strong signal to the market, right? Like, okay,
Yeah.
if those giants are setting up shop here, there's got to be something good going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So those anchor tenants, they don't just bring in a lot of investment, create a lot of jobs themselves, but they attract all these other related businesses, suppliers, the whole network.
Right. It ripples outward.
Right. Okay, so fast forward to today, 2025. What does the actual CRE market look like in Whitestown right now? The article gives us, I think, a pretty clear picture. What would you say is the most prominent type of property there?
Well, it's got to be industrial, right? I mean, we're talking over 10 million square feet of industrial space now.
Yeah, and it's not just a bunch of these, like, mega warehouses.
Right.
They've got a real range. So the article mentions more adaptable, like 100,000 square foot buildings all the way up to the million square foot giants that we were just talking about.
Yeah, so it's flexible. It can accommodate a variety of needs.
Right. And, we've got Amazon, obviously, but also GXO Logistics. Weaver Popcorn's got a 400,000 square foot facility there.
Wow, popcorn.
I know, right?
That's interesting.
It is. And it shows you the real breadth of that industrial sector, like not just logistics, but manufacturing as well.
That's a good sign, right? I mean, it means there's diversity in the economy. It's not just reliant on one type of business.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not just all about logistics, right? I mean, there's this growing retail presence, especially along I-65.
Makes sense. As the population grows, you need places for people to shop, eat, all that.
Right. And it makes sense, as the population expands, as there's more traffic along that corridor, that demand for those consumer-facing services is going to go up.
Right, you got to have your Starbucks and your fast casual spots.
Exactly, yeah. And then what's interesting and what's maybe a little surprising is they even have office space starting to develop within the Anson project.
Oh, okay, so they're attracting a different kind of business then.
Yeah, exactly. So industrial and retail, those have really been the big growth drivers. But now we're starting to see this emergence of what they call Class A office space in Anson. And it's not a ton, but, 50,000 to 100,000 square feet. And that suggests that the market's maturing.
Right, so you're seeing like a more well-rounded, balanced kind of economy starting to emerge.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the kinds of office spaces that can command higher lease rates. They're the newer buildings with all the bells and whistles.
Right, the high-quality finishes, the professional management, and all that.
Exactly. And those attract businesses that are looking for, a premium image, the best functionality.
Right. So it's not just about being cheap. It's about projecting a certain image, being part of a certain kind of business environment.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's get into some actual numbers.
Yeah.
The article gives us some really interesting market metrics from 2024 CBRE data. And this helps us, I think, really understand, like, the health of the market, how things are actually performing.
Okay. Yeah, let's hear it.
So industrial vacancy rate, get this, just 3.2%.
Whoa, that's low.
Yeah, it's super tight. And what that suggests is that there is very strong demand from businesses, right?
Right, so when spaces become available, they're getting snapped up pretty quickly.
Exactly. And that often leads to upward pressure on rents.
Yeah.
It gives the landlords more power to increase what they're charging.
Yeah, classic supply and demand, right?
Exactly. And speaking of demand, that absorption rate, the amount of space being taken up each year, 1.5 million square feet annually over the past 5 years.
So it's consistent, too. It's not just a blip. It's a steady trend.
Yeah, that's a really strong indicator that Whitestown is attractive to industrial users, that there's a pipeline of companies that are either looking to set up shop there or expand their existing operations.
Yeah, it's a vote of confidence, right? I mean, they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Absolutely. Now, retail vacancy is a little higher at 5%.
Okay.
And I think that might be because some of these newer developments, they're still kind of filling up. They're still attracting tenants.
Yeah, that makes sense. It takes time to get those spaces leased out, especially in a growing area. You've got to find the right mix of businesses, the right kind of appeal.
Right. And then office vacancy is at 7%.
Okay. And is that because it's a newer, smaller part of the market?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's still relatively early days for office space in Whitestown. But 7% is not bad at all.
No, that's pretty healthy, especially considering it's a growing market. It suggests there's room for expansion for new businesses to come in.
Exactly. So let's talk about the money. What are people actually paying for all this space?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah, literally, right.
Yeah.
So industrial lease rates, they're averaging $30 per square foot.
Okay.
And the article points out that that's actually a 10% increase from 2020.
Wow, so rents are going up.
Yeah. And that reflects, all that strong demand that we were just talking about.
Right. If there are more businesses wanting space than there is space available, the prices are going to go up.
Exactly. Now, retail rents are a little higher, between $32 and $35 per square foot.
Okay.
And then office rents are sitting between $28 and $32 per square foot.
So it sounds like Whitestown is really becoming a viable competitor, especially when you compare it to some of those neighboring areas.
Yeah, it's starting to make a lot of sense, I think, for businesses that are looking at commercial real estate in that region.
Yeah, it's offering compelling alternative, especially if those prices are more attractive than, say, Indianapolis.
Exactly. So what are the big things, the fundamental factors that have actually driven this growth?
Mm.
Why is Whitestown taking off like this?
Well, you got to start with location, right?
Yeah?
Prime real estate, it's all about location, and Whitestown's location is strategic, right? Right on I-65, major north-south artery.
Yeah. Huge advantage.
Huge advantage. I mean, you're talking about access to transportation networks. You're talking about being within a day's drive of something like 70% of the U.S. population. That's a massive draw for businesses, especially logistics and distribution.
It is, and then you add to that the fact that it's right near the Indianapolis International Airport.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. So you've got air cargo, too.
Yeah, it's a major FedEx super hub.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
Yeah, and that's got to be a massive benefit for companies that need, that kind of fast, reliable shipping, the time-sensitive stuff.
Right, so you've got this perfect storm almost of transportation options, right? You've got the highways, the air cargo, it's all right there.
Yeah, it really creates that powerful logistics ecosystem.
Oh,
It
yeah.
makes Whitestown very attractive for any company that's involved in supply chain management.
Makes sense. I mean, if you're moving goods, that's the kind of place you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing that I think really helps is the business-friendly policies that they've got in Boone County.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And the big one that they highlight is the tax abatements.
Oh, yeah, those can be a huge incentive for developers and businesses.
They are. And we're talking about, a 50% property tax reduction for 10 years on new builds.
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah. So that's a really big deal,
I
right?
mean, that can make a huge difference in terms of the overall cost of a project.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's just do some quick math. If you've got a $10 million project, we're talking potential savings of $500,000 annually
Yeah.
just on property taxes. That's going straight to the bottom line.
That makes Whitestown look a lot more attractive, I bet, than some other areas that have higher tax burdens.
Yeah, for sure. And then, beyond the tax breaks, they've also got this really streamlined permitting process,
Oh, so it's easier to get things.
much faster.
Okay.
Yeah. The article mentions that it takes like 60 days to get permits in Whitestown versus 90 to 120 days in Indianapolis.
Whoa, that's a big difference.
It is. And that kind of stuff really matters to developers,
Yeah.
right? Time is money, as they say.
Absolutely. I mean, the faster you can get a project up and running, the sooner you can start generating revenue.
Exactly. But, none of this matters, right, if you don't have the people to do the work.
Right. The workforce is crucial.
Yeah. And that's where the growing labor pool in Boone County comes into play.
Okay.
So the population, it's up 15% since 2015.
Okay, so there's a larger pool of potential employees.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not just about the numbers, right?
Right. You need the skills to match.
Exactly. And a lot of these folks, they already have experience in logistics, in manufacturing. And that's perfect for the kinds of businesses that Whitestown is attracting.
Right. So it's a win-win. Businesses get the workforce they need, and people get jobs in their field.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The article does this really smart thing where it directly compares Whitestown to its neighbors.
Okay.
So we get a sense of, Whitestown's specific strengths. So first up, we've got Lebanon. It's about 10 miles north, so geographically closest.
Okay.
And there's a pretty big difference in the CRE landscape between the two.
Okay. How so?
Well, for one thing, Lebanon's industrial inventory is way smaller,
Okay.
only about 4 million square feet.
Right, compared to Whitestown's 10 million.
Yeah, and a lot of Lebanon's industrial space is older, and that leads to lower average lease rates.
Okay.
So $26 to $28 per square foot.
That's a pretty significant difference.
Yeah, 10 to 15% lower than what you see in Whitestown.
And why is that? Is it just because the buildings are older?
Yeah, partly that. I mean, older buildings, they tend to be less desirable.
Right.
But it's also, the physical characteristics of the buildings themselves.
Oh, okay.
So in Lebanon, a lot of those industrial facilities, they've got lower ceiling heights,
Okay.
24 to 28 feet.
Right, and modern logistics, I bet they need higher ceilings, right?
Yeah.
Racking systems, automation, all that stuff.
Exactly, yeah. And Whitestown, they've got those newer buildings with the 36 to 40-foot ceilings, which is kind of the standard now for those big modern operations.
Yeah, makes sense. You can't really fit a giant robot arm in a space with a low ceiling.
Right. And then the other thing is the absorption rate. It's much slower in Lebanon.
Okay.
So only 500,000 square feet per year.
Right, versus Whitestown's 1.5 million.
Yeah. And that just shows that the demand is, it's much higher in Whitestown.
Right. And infrastructure probably plays a role too, right? I mean, less
Well,
direct access to I-65, that's going to make a difference.
yeah, absolutely. Even a small detour can add up in terms of time and cost for transportation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're a trucking company, every minute counts, right?
Absolutely. And then it's interesting, the article also points out a difference in the kinds of companies that are locating in each place.
Oh, okay.
So Lebanon, they tend to attract more of that traditional manufacturing,
Okay.
while Waitstown is really becoming a hub for e-commerce for logistics.
Yeah, that makes sense given what we've been talking about with the infrastructure and the building specifications and all that.
Exactly. And they give an example, the article, of a 200,000 square foot plant that was leased in Lebanon back in 2023.
Okay.
And that was, a decent deal for Lebanon, but it just shows you the difference in scale and pace compared to the kinds of deals that are happening in Whitestown.
Right. It's a different kind of market altogether.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to Zionsville. This is southeast of Whitestown, about 10 miles.
Okay.
And this is a completely different animal.
Oh, really? How so?
Yeah, Zionsville is much smaller, much more affluent, and they're really focused on preserving that, that small town charm, that character.
Okay.
So their CRE market is like tiny compared to Whitestown. Only about 1.5 million square feet total.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah. And it's mostly like boutique retail, smaller office spaces.
Okay.
They have very little industrial zoning, which I think reflects their priorities.
Right. They're not looking to become a logistics hub.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that emphasis on charm, on catering to a more, upscale clientele, it drives retail rents way up,
Okay.
$35 to $40 per square foot.
Wow, that's a lot higher than Whitestown.
Yeah, and office rents are higher there too.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? If you're in a prime location, a desirable area, you can charge more.
Right. And the other big thing is land availability. Zionsville, they just don't have much left.
Okay.
Only about 300 developable acres.
Right, so that limits how much they can grow.
Exactly. They can't do these huge projects like Anson that Whitestown can handle.
Right, so they're kind of capped in terms of their potential.
Yeah. And the article makes that point really well with an example, right?
Right.
They compare a small retail plaza deal in Zionsville to a much larger retail development in Whitestown, and the price per square foot is actually lower in Whitestown.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so finally, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, Indianapolis.
Yeah, the big one.
Yeah, about 20 miles southeast of Whitestown.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's a huge established market.
Right. Can't really compare apples to apples there.
Yeah. So Indianapolis, we're talking about 50 million square feet of CRE.
Wow, that dwarfs everything else.
It does. And as you'd expect, lease rates are way higher across the board.
Okay.
Industrial, retail, office, everything.
Yeah, prime real estate, prime prices.
Exactly. And land costs are dramatically higher, too.
Okay, and how much are we talking about?
Well, in Indianapolis, it's $200,000 to $500,000 per acre.
Wow.
In Whitestown, it's $50,000 to $100,000.
That's a huge difference.
It is.
Yeah.
And that just shows you the massive difference in the initial investment that's required for development.
Right. So just to get started in Indianapolis, you need a lot more capital.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, Indianapolis does have a very strong absorption rate,
Okay.
but their vacancy rates are actually pretty similar to Whitestown's.
Oh, interesting. So even though more space is being taken up, there's also a lot more space available overall.
Exactly. And the article does this interesting thing where it talks about the trade-offs in terms of logistics.
Okay.
So Indianapolis, you've got that direct airport access,
All right.
but Whitestown has that I-65 location and a lot less traffic.
Okay.
And that reduced congestion, that can be a real advantage for trucking companies, for delivery times, for efficiency.
Yeah, time is money, right? If you can get your goods delivered faster and cheaper, that's a big deal.
Exactly. And the article mentions 20% less traffic in Whitestown.
Wow, that's significant.
It is. And then the other thing is operating costs.
Okay.
They're higher in Indianapolis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So property taxes, utilities, all that.
Yeah, all that stuff. And that can really eat into a company's profits.
Right. So even though you might be in a bigger, more established market, those extra costs can offset some of the advantages.
Exactly. And the article gives some specific numbers to back that up.
Okay.
They compare a 400,000 square foot deal in Indianapolis to a similar one in Whitestown, and the cost difference is like really eye-opening.
Wow. So Whitestown is really starting to look like a smart choice financially.
Yeah, it is. All right, so based on all these comparisons, what are Whitestown's real competitive advantages?
Well, like we've been saying, location is a big one.
Yeah.
Access to I-65, being near that FedEx hub at the airport, that creates a really strong draw for any business that's involved in moving goods around.
Yeah, I mean, JLL even ranks it as one of the top logistics nodes in Indiana.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Amazon has said that they've actually reduced shipping times thanks to their Whitestown location.
That's impressive.
It is. And then cost efficiency. That's another huge advantage.
Right. Lower lease rates, cheaper land, those tax abatements, it all adds up to serious savings.
Yeah, the article actually gives some examples of potential savings, like, millions of dollars annually.
Wow.
Yeah. And that can be a real game changer for a business, right? It can make all the difference in terms of profitability.
Absolutely. I mean, you can invest those savings back into your business, hire more people, expand your operations.
Exactly. And then there's the whole development momentum thing.
Right. It sounds like Whitestown is still growing, still attracting investment.
Yeah, that Anson project, it's still a big engine for growth, and they've got a lot of new projects in the pipeline.
So it's not just a one-hit wonder, it's a sustained trend.
Exactly. And they've got these fast permitting processes, planned infrastructure upgrades. Like they're really thinking ahead.
Yeah, that's smart. You got to stay ahead of the curve, right? Anticipate future needs.
Right. And then the last thing, and this is maybe a little less tangible, is the whole community and lifestyle aspect.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Whitestown, it's got good schools, affordable housing, parks. It's a nice place to live.
Right. So it's not just about the business environment, it's about the quality of life for employees.
Exactly. And that can be a big draw for workers, especially in today's competitive job market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you can offer a good work-life balance, that's a huge perk.
It is. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. What's Whitestown's overall position in the central Indiana CRE market?
Well, it sounds like they found a really good niche, right?
Yeah, they've really positioned themselves as an attractive alternative to those bigger, more expensive markets.
Right. And they're outperforming those smaller markets too.
Exactly. I mean, you look at the absorption rates, the low vacancy rates, it's a very healthy market.
Yeah, it's clearly in demand.
It is. And the article points to, continued growth potential, appreciation in property values, attractive cap rates for investors.
So there's opportunity there.
Yeah, it seems like there's a sense of urgency, If you want to get in on this, you got to act fast.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, if those trends continue, those prices are only going to go up.
Exactly. And the article wraps up with this people also ask section, which is always interesting, right? It gives you insight into what people are actually curious about.
Right. What are the common questions?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, there are a lot of questions about the actual costs in Whitestown. Like, how do they compare to Indianapolis?
Right. That's the bottom line for a lot of people, right? What's it going to cost me?
Exactly. And then there's a question about finding a good CRE agent in Whitestown.
Oh, okay. And I bet they recommend Cara Conde.
They do, yeah. I mean, it's her article, right?
Right. Well, she's obviously an expert.
Yeah, she clearly knows her stuff.
Hmm.
And then people want to know about the different types of properties that are available.
Okay.
So the article talks about the different sectors, industrial, retail, office.
Right. Gives people a sense of the options.
Exactly. And then the big question, is Whitestown a good place to invest?
Yeah, that's the ultimate question, right?
It is. And the article seems to suggest that it is. They point to the cap rates, the
Mhm.
potential for appreciation, the low vacancy rates.
Yeah, it paints a pretty positive picture.
It does. And then lastly, they talk about the key industries that are driving all this growth.
Okay.
So logistics and e-commerce, that's the big one,
Yeah, we've been talking about that a lot.
right? And then manufacturing, retail, and the growing office sector.
Right. So the diverse mix of businesses.
Yeah. All right, so to wrap things up, it's clear that Whitestown has really transformed itself.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story.
It is. And they've managed to, kind of carve out this really unique position for themselves in the central Indiana CRE market.
Right. They're offering something different, something appealing.
Yeah, and they've got this compelling combination of affordability, strategic location, and ongoing development.
Right. And it's working for them.
It is.
Yeah.
And when you compare them to, Lebanon, Zionsville, Indianapolis, it's clear that Whitestown is doing something right.
Yeah, they're definitely a force to be reckoned with.
They are. So here's our final thought for you. Considering everything we've talked about today, what do you think? What emerging opportunities do you see in Whitestown's CRE market over the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a good question.
Yeah. And what factors, maybe things we haven't even considered, might influence their continued growth? Or, could there be challenges on the horizon?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
It is. It's a fascinating story, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how it unfolds.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for breaking it all down.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.